Good morning. I'm going to talk to you today about the British Council's involvement in language testing over a considerable period from 1941 to 2013. The starting point really is my concern that all language testers need a sense of history. If we are to be literate in assessment, I think we need to take account of what's happened before us. One of my favourite sayings is, "There is nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it is said, 'See, this is new'? It has already been in the ages before us." And I think there's a very strong message for language testers, and particularly for people who are starting out in language testing, that a lot has happened in the past which is of great relevance to us today. And I'm going to start by giving you a few examples of developments in testing in the past. Which I think are of relevance. Leonard Spolsky has written that when he was describing testing oral proficiency in an article in language testing, he says that many Americans considered that the first oral interview happened in the 1950s with the FSI development of the FSI scale. He then goes on to point out that in fact people had been working on this much earlier, and quotes the example of Jack Roach at Cambridge, who wrote a seminal paper on testing spoken language. But we can go back even further than that. Glenn Fulcher, in a recent timeline of the history of testing spoken language, traces the first development back really to 1834, when a headmaster of Greenwich Royal Hospital was developing a scale for various things, including language. Fisher was introduced the scales. I think it's around about 1842 the first scales came into being, and they were used, I think, in the first place by the Admiralty for deciding whether boys in the Greenwich hospital schools were trainable in navigation. It's a very early example. We're all very familiar with the CEFR these days, and a great play is made of that being a set of scales, and we often tend to forget that work in the past has gone on, and I think we can learn from that work. Another example is the work of Thorndike. I was taken aback really when yet another American suggested we might want to develop a set of references for the use of language testers, as particularly PhD students, which they could read, and he suggested we started in the 1950s. Given my first quote that not to know what happened before you were born is always to remain a child, this rather worried me, as I was born in 1950, but I digress. But you can go back, and this slide illustrates the work of Thorndike at a very early stage, back in the early 20th century, where he was one of the first people to actually set about developing a scale in a very systematic, organized fashion, and we can learn a lot from it today. So rather than sitting in his ivory tower, as has happened many times in the 20th century, people develop scales, often off the top of their heads, I mean very bright heads, but nevertheless off the top of their heads, he suggests a way of doing it empirically, which I think is a good lesson for people around the world who want to develop scales. And in a sense, Fisher was already doing that. Fisher collected in his scale books for writing samples of the writing at the various levels. My last example is in the area of reading into writing. We seem to have come full circle in the over the last century, in that summary was considered a very useful test in the early days, particularly at Cambridge. So we have Precy tests from the 1930s. These tended to disappear in the 1970s, but are making a comeback today in TOEFL IBT. But one of the most interesting books I came across when I was doing the research for the history of Cambridge exams, Measured Constructs, was this book by Robeson. Again, it was one of those references I tracked down through Google and located it in a digitalized archive in an American university. It was impossible to get in Britain. But it was probably the most succinct definition of what Precy involved that I came across. And you can read it there. The object of the Precy is that anyone who has not time to read the original correspondence, they used to give them several letters which they had to Precy, might, by reading the Precy, be put in possession of all the leading features of what passed. The merits of such a Precy are A, to include all that is important in the correspondence, and B, to present this in a consecutive and readable shape, and it's the last line I think really encapsulates it, expressed as distinctly as possible and as briefly as is compatible with distinctness. And I thought, this guy is, interestingly, yet another headmaster. He was the headmaster of Eton. And it seems headmasters in the 19th and early 20th century, unlike today, had a lot of time on their hands to write these scholarly works. So, increasingly in CRELLA, in the United Kingdom where I work, myself and my colleagues are interested in how we can promote assessment literacy. And one of the ways I think this can happen, or can be facilitated, is by familiarity with how a construct was measured in the past. This can give us a valuable perspective when developing new tests or critiquing existing ones. So really the first lesson I think that I'd like to impart to you is, we started off with there is nothing new under the sun, but Ambrose Bierce, in the strangely titled The Devil's Dictionary, puts it quite nicely. He says, but there are lots of old things we don't know. And I rather like that, because I think that's very true. I think many of us in the profession are not really aware of what has happened even within our own lifetimes, let alone before it. And this links quite nicely to what I want to develop today. I feel quite strongly that exam boards, test developers, need to preserve, write their own histories, and archive important documents for posterity. This is in effect what Cambridge English Language Assessment has done. They have a pretty good archive. It's not complete, but they have materials going back at least till 1913, when the exam started. So the Cambridge CPE ran from 1913 to 2013 to the present. And my view is that there are many examination boards around the world. College English Test has been going, I think, since about 1986. The Aiken tests in Japan have been going since the 1960s. And I think it's quite important that these exam boards preserve at least copies of the examinations and any important papers, minutes of meetings, which show how the exams were developed. I've been talking to people recently in Trinity, and I was very interested to see that Trinity themselves had spoken language exams for overseas students starting in 1938. So again, about 18 years before the FSI. But then you go back even further, they had spoken language exams at different levels from 1866. Now, it wasn't really until the 1980s that exam boards and curriculum designers, etc., started thinking about levels. Trinity had levels in the 19th century, and it would be interesting to see how they and we're going to try and dig into the archives to see how they operationalize those levels. What I'm going to talk to you about for next half hour or so is really very closely linked to what I've just said, that I'm very keen. I started as a historian, so 40 years ago I was doing a doctorate in history, which I thought was the start of my academic career at LSE in London. And financial stringency meant I went to Iran to become an English language teacher instead, as I couldn't get a grant. But I've retained that interest in history. I just finished the book on measured constructs for Cambridge. So I also, while I was researching the background for measured constructs, in the archives at Cambridge I came across some interesting information relating to Cambridge's relationship with the British Council. And from that grew an idea which has now blossomed into my, it's going to keep me busy for the next 3 years, is writing a history of the British Council and testing in the 20th century. And the history of the British Council is very interesting. About 1976, 77, Bernard Spolsky described 3 stages in the history of language testing. And those 3 stages were the traditional approaches in the early days, so Cambridge CPE in 1913 would fit in with Spolsky's first phase, which he termed the pre-scientific. Keith Morrow was to call this the Garden of Eden, where there was not too much, people were not overly concerned with reliability. And there are a number of council tests. The Diploma of English Studies, which grew out of a suggestion from the British Council Institute in Cairo, which was really, and I'll talk a bit about these in a minute, but just to give you an overview. And a rather informal interview, the Knowledge of English form, and then a slightly more sophisticated form in 1958. So very much in the sort of traditional approach to language testing, a very sort of informal approach. This tightens up in the 1960s, particularly with the work of people like Lardo in the States, and also the influence of the American psychometricians began to kick in. And again, I'll say a little bit more about how this affected Britain in the first EAP test in the 1960s, the Davis test, EPTB. The third stage brings us up to the present. The British Council, I am finding out from looking at the archives at Cambridge, was really one of the first movers in the direction of a needs-based approach to developing language exams. And really one of the first communicative tests is the ELTS test in the 1980s, and subsequently the IELTS and APTIS. So I'm going to say a little bit about each of these in turn, but I think Spolsky, in a later article, said he didn't think the 3 phases quite fitted. And it didn't fit the CPE because in the early CPE there were exams from really some quite communicative exams, actually. There was a test of speaking, a test of writing, even at a very early stage. But for the Council, the British Council, it does seem to fall nicely into these 3 phases. Let's say a little bit about the early phase, called by Spolsky the pre-scientific. Keith Morrow, who was one of the communicative language testers in the 1970s, labelled it the Garden of Eden. Really, because people were, sort of very happy and, it was a very laid back and a sort of fairly casual approach to testing. The things to pick out really is the cooperation with Cambridge from 1941, which lasted over 50 years. In that period, up to about 1989, the Cambridge had a limited number of people dealing with English language testing exams, and they were helped greatly by the experience of people from the British Council on the Joint Committee, which was one of the main committee overseeing Cambridge exams. And that lasted for 50 years, and there was some very interesting research done in that period, which was joint between the Council and Cambridge. In particular, the Council were responsible for the Diploma of English Studies in 1945. This was an exam asked for, initiated by the British Council, but also the British Council wrote the specification and wrote the first tests. And then we begin to get quite an interesting development in the 1950s, which I think will be a major theme in the book I'm writing on the British Council with my colleague and friend Barry O'Sullivan. And what happens in the 1950s is that it became British government policy to attract overseas students to Britain. And the British Council were heavily involved with government in facilitating that. So as the numbers began to rise, I think there were about 4,000 or 5,000 already by the 1950s, overseas students in Britain. The British Council became responsible abroad for screening applicants. And this informal method, this informal interview, the knowledge of English form, grew up. So, I've gone quickly through these. So the work with the British Council, the development of what I called a D level. The diploma was meant to be a level above Cambridge CPE. So people talk these days about, should we have a D level? Well, there was a D level above C1 and C2 already in the 1950s, 1940s. The birth of EAP testing, I've talked about screening procedures for students coming to Britain. This is the form. Nobody had ever seen this form, but we managed to dig it out in the National Archives in Kew, where in a set of papers we found this form. This is just the English one. There's one for reading, listening and writing as well. It's a very early scale, but again, note the date, 1954. Predates FSI. So an attempt was made, even at a very early age, and this is not particularly bad. I mean, it's very limited. It's just a bland set of statements where they had to put the person wanting to come to Britain to study, they had to say which level they would go on. This was slightly improved in '58. They provided more detail. They provided a clearer view of the level that the student would have to meet. And this was largely because George Perrin in the early '60s had begun to question the reliability of the test. There had been complaints in Britain that it wasn't effectively screening those students who are coming for 1 year. The big problem in EAP testing is that when students are on MA courses, 9-month courses, there's very little time to do anything about it if you only find out about the problem when the students arrive. And it's normally not even in the first term of a 9-month course you find out the problem. It's only when they start having to write at the end of the first term, beginning of the second. So, this took us into the second phase. So, with the growth in student numbers, with apparent problems in assessing language informally, then people began to worry in the 1960s about whether it could be done better. Robert Lardo, in fact, visited Cambridge in 1960, and this was about the time that his books were coming out, which had a sort of heavily structuralist emphasis. And you can see by the titles of his books. It's not that he was against testing writing and speaking, but he didn't think it could be done reliably. So in '63, Alan Davis was sponsored by the British Council to do a PhD at Birmingham, one of the first students sponsored by the British Council, quite a few subsequently, and he did this under guidance from George Perrin. Now, EPT is in many ways a very interesting test. It's firmly in that psychometric structuralist tradition because there's an emphasis on discrete point testing, but there are some interesting additional things about it. This is 1965. It has a reading and a listening component, comprehension component. Cambridge doesn't have comprehension really until 1975. But even more interestingly is there's a paper in reading and listening for science students, and there's a paper for non-science students. So 15 years before the ELTS test, Davis was already constructing tests, ESP tests. So in a sense, these were the first ESP tests. Now obviously, you're influenced by the ideas of the time you're writing. When Davis was doing his thesis in the 60s, psychometric structuralism was very strong. And people believed that discrete point testing, objective testing, quite often multiple choice testing, was the way to go. But you'll notice that in the reading component, there's perhaps uniquely in British approaches to testing, there's a test of reading speed. Reading quickly is recognized today as just as important as reading carefully in academic English. Davis, admittedly, it's a rather strange speed reading test where you had a reading passage, and I can't remember whether it was Welsh words or Turkish words had been inserted, and you had to find where these words were. But nevertheless, it was tapping into a part of this construct that is not normally measured, i.e. expeditious reading, to this day. So the Davis test kicks off in '65, begins to be used by the British Council all around the world. Early 1960s, the British Council had been given the responsibility by the government, it became linked to the Department of Trade and Industry, to take over all responsibility for overseas students coming to Britain. That meant they had to get their act together, which they did with EPTB, but nevertheless, there were some constraints on EPTB. The council, like most institutions, they wanted something that could be done quickly, and they weren't really that interested in speaking and writing in the 1960s and 70s. So EPTB, though it's a very, I think it's a very impressive test for its period, didn't actually concern itself with speaking and writing. And this led to some problems. During the first period, the traditional period, in addition, sorry, it's very sensitive. In addition, during the psychometric structuralist period, there wasn't a great deal of concern with the construct validity of the tests being measured. Did the tests operationalize an underlying construct? What was the underlying construct? Alan Davis, in the very first issue of Language Testing back in 1984, almost 30 years ago, said, in the end, no empirical study can improve a test's validity. What is important is the preliminary thinking and the preliminary analysis as to the nature of the language learning we aim to capture. And I think this is probably, if you wanted one sentence to sum up what our approach to language testing should be, it's that one. I'm not going to talk in this lecture about the different traditions between America and Britain. America became predominantly, or adopted predominantly, a psychometric approach, largely because of numbers. They had to test millions of students, millions of military personnel at the beginning of the 20th century, and they were left with very little choice but to go for objective multiple choice tests. But Davis quite rightly points out, and this relates to EPTB and relates to the earlier tests, is that no matter how sophisticated the statistics, no matter how complex the statistical analysis you do, what really counts is the construct. It's a theory on which everything rests. And I think this colours, in many sense, the final period I'm going to talk to you about. It has influenced the work of myself and my colleagues in CRELLA in the UK, and I think we've all been driven by the need to address construct first. You start with the construct. A lot of our work, as I'll say in a minute, has been driven by attempts to define the constructs in a more clear, accessible way, so as to facilitate description of proficiency at different levels. What is the construct, say, of reading at different levels? Because we have to operate in the work we do in testing students at different levels. So, the final stage of British Council's approaches to testing, Symposium, I think, called it the psycholinguistic, sociolinguistic, which was not a bad title as it turned out. We might say socio-cognitive these days. But in the 1970s, we kick off with that's when the communicative approach really kicks off. It begins to gather steam in Europe through the Council of Europe in the early 1970s. And the first realization, and I'm going to say a little bit about each of these tests, was first of all the IELTS test in 1980. And the history of the IELTS test, I think, is very interesting. I've just, over the last couple of months, managed to get the minutes of the IELTS Steering Committee, the IELTS Management Committee, the IELTS Task Force, I think it was called. So I'm beginning to uncover how IELTS actually came about and who was responsible. And in terms of the design of the test, it looks pretty certain that John Mumby, who wrote his thesis, these are all British Council officers. John Mumby wrote his thesis on communicative language needs. Brendan Carroll was writing about testing language performance in the 80s. And Alan Moller did his PhD thesis on previous approaches to EAP assessment, and he compared older versions of British Council exams with newer. Later, 1980s, IELTS had been going for a few years. They decided, for a variety of reasons, I'll talk about some of them, to reform it in the late 1980s. And then more recently, the British Council has begun to develop its own tests again, rather than tests done in conjunction with Cambridge. And we have International Language Assessment, which is a placement test used in its council offices around the world. And we have APTIS, which is a general purpose English test, which can be modified and which is being modified for local contexts. So I'll say a little bit about each of these. The 1970s saw further movements from teaching language as a system, i.e. the lexico-grammatical approach, structuralist approach, to teaching it as a means of communication. And I could mention a lot of people here, but Henry Widdowson is probably one of the drivers, along with people like Chris Canlin and others, people at Reading, David Wilkins and Keith Morrow, Keith Johnson. But there's an emphasis, there's a move towards English as a means of communication, rather than a system that you can analyze and learn about. So the emphasis is no longer on linguistic accuracy, but on the ability to function effectively through language in particular contexts of situation. Davis, in his book on EAP testing, describes EPTB, the English Proficiency Test Battery he was responsible for, as being swept away. At least he had the joy of having a test named after him, even though the Davis test, EPTB, is commonly called. But nevertheless, the communicative revolution saw its end. He sees IELTS as taking up a strong communicative approach in its use of real-life examples of specific language uses. And I'll come on to that in a minute. So in the mid-1970s, a project was established to replace EPTB, to replace some of the problems the test was facing. EPTB was not doing a bad job in terms of predictive validity, but there was a feeling that it didn't give receiving institutions sufficient information about students' abilities in listening, reading and writing, the type of things they would need in an academic context. So the new communicative approach brought with it a much greater emphasis on the use of language skills in context. There's a shift towards a more contextualized language and use-oriented approach to testing comprehension, particularly of spoken and written language. So the new ELTS test, which began developing, the first ideas began in 1975. It started off by a request from the British Council to Cambridge to develop them a test for its use in its operations abroad. So the request was, interestingly, British Council asked Cambridge, can you write us a test? What seems to happen, I'm still tunneling into the details, is that people like John Mumby, the communicative needs analysis, Brendan Carroll, Alan Moller became involved, and there's a shift in the late 70s to the council developing the test and taking it in an overtly ESP direction and communicative direction. And this is really where my life as a tester starts, because in 1980 I was involved in writing the social studies module. So I've always thought ELTS was a really, really good test because I was involved. But I also quite, very much liked what they were trying to do. So, broad areas of studies. There's a general academic on the bottom, but there was a module for life sciences, social studies, physical sciences, technology, and medicine. There was a reading test, listening test, a study skills test. The M are the modular, the physics, the social studies, etc. There was a writing test. The writing test was linked to the reading passages. 1980. It's only now, in 2010, 11, 12, 13, that international test providers are beginning to revisit again the idea of reading into writing, the idea of intertextuality, the idea that students, when they get to university, they actually have to read several texts for a writing task. They don't just read a title, they read texts and they combine those texts. That was back in 1980. And there was an individual interview, based in relation to general things, but also back to the reading. Almost as soon as it had started, the British Council and UCCLES commissioned a validation study, which I still find, I'm still going through the archives to find out why, but the validation study in the event didn't report until 1986. And then it was taken that decision was taken about the need to move ELTS on. And it would become IELTS, International English Language Testing System. The addition of an I at the beginning reflects the addition of a partner, IDP in Australia, to the Cambridge and British Council cooperation. What I suspect was driving it, and this is again something to be considered, was that a feeling had been there, perhaps in the 1980s, that it was too cumbersome. It was too difficult to write modules for all these different subject specialisms. And it's a very interesting period, the 1980s, because ESP had been a very strong force in the 70s, and that's why ELTS looked like it did when it began. But almost, not immediately, but very soon, people began to move away from it, largely, I think, because of practical difficulties. What is interesting now, of course, is that many exam boards are going back to ESP. So even Cambridge, even though they have general English tests, they have IELTS and other tests, they now have a test for lawyers, they have a test for finance, they have a test for business. they have a test for teachers. So the pendulum, I think, has swung against ESP, but I think it's quite probably swinging back to ESP. 1995, we see the end of the subject-specific modules. You get one academic reading module, one academic writing module. Sorry, this keeps slipping. And Caroline Clapham, who did her PhD on the reading, the IELTS reading, provided a justification for it in terms of she was able to argue that in the case of the IELTS tests she looked at, you weren't biased against, the student wasn't biased against if he took a general as against a specific module. 1995, the link between reading and writing went. And retrospectively, I think this is sad. Because what one lost was that differentiation between knowledge telling and knowledge transforming. That when you moved away from using different texts, you actually reduced the amount of intertextuality, in fact all intertextuality, that was in the old exam. Well, other good things came in as well. It became much better administratively. It gathered test data on student performance, etc. But I still look back and I think moving from ELTS to IELTS, we may have lost something. But then again, that's just my personal view. We move now into the final period, one that myself and my colleagues in CRELLA, particularly Linda Taylor, have been involved in. Back in, I think it was 2003, the germ of an idea sprang up. And I used to go down and talk with Linda at Cambridge and suggest, perhaps we could begin to reconceptualize our approach to validity and validation. This met with a certain amount of, what would be the right word, lack of conviction on the part of some of Linda's colleagues. But nevertheless, we pressed ahead. And Mike Milanovic and Nick Saville gave us a good deal of support. So what I've called the SILT Construct project was born in 2003. And 10 years later, what we see are 4 volumes in the SILT series, which I have labeled the post-communicative era. So we've moved on from the notion of skills and sub-skills. We've moved much more in the direction of what I would call the socio-cognitive approach. So you see on the screen the volumes Examining Writing, which was 2007, Examining Reading, 2009, which I was heavily involved in, and then the 2 volumes Linda was responsible for, Examining Speaking and Examining Listening. Speaking was 2011, Listening 2013. What these volumes did, I think, is very interesting. That they've established, over the 10-year period, socio-cognitive frameworks for evaluating the various components of construct validity in each of the broad skill areas of reading, writing, listening, and speaking. And these were then applied to Cambridge ESOL exams at 5 different proficiency levels, A2 to C2. The focus was no longer just on language, communicative functions. The byword for the communicative approach was functions, functions, functions. So there was often a greater concern with the language of the tests and a far lesser concern, which you can see in the CFR and other publications during the last 20 years, a concern with the cognitive processes required for operating at different levels of proficiency. And the reason we found this important to follow both the linguistic as well as the psycholinguistic, the socio as well as the cognitive, is that unlike America, or most American tests, in Europe, from the 1980s onwards, because of the move towards European Union, the growing need for exams which would differentiate at different levels, there was a whole movement towards that in Europe, of which Cambridge obviously part of. It had had FCE, which is called LCE, Lower Certificate, in 1939. It had CPE in 1913. It was in the 80s and early 90s that you got PET and CET and CAE. Now, if you're going to discriminate between levels, contextual validity is not sufficient. It's not sufficient to describe the grammar, the lexis, the organizational structure of texts, etc. We also need to describe what's happening, what students are capable of doing in cognitive processing at the various levels. So I want to look at those, really just the top two, the context and cognitive validity. So, cognitive validity. Do the cognitive processes required to complete test tasks sufficiently resemble the cognitive processes a candidate would normally employ in non-test conditions? Are they construct relevant? So, since Cronbach in the 1950s and probably before, through Messick in 1989, people have been interested in the construct. People talk a lot about construct. We need to think about the construct in our tests. Are the range of processes elicited by test items sufficiently comprehensive to be considered construct representative of real-world behavior? I mentioned earlier Alan Davis's reading speed test. My construct of reading involves careful reading, but it also involves expeditious, quick, efficient, selective reading. So any test, for me, above a certain level, that is, I would wish to make claims for it being construct valid, needs to cover both types of reading. Now, there is a big gap in most of the literature on cognitive validity. Before 2000, you look at any of the books I wrote on language testing, it's not mentioned. In most PhD theses on language testing, it's not mentioned. It's not there in the CFR. So it seems to me that people have often talked about the need for cognitive validity. People claim, oh yes, we're interested in cognitive processing. They may well be interested, but they don't actually sit down and try to operationalize it in language tests so that the test represents the type of processing that is appropriate in real life. Context validity is more common. Context validity relates to the contextual parameters of the test, the performance conditions, the setting under which the task is performed. Do they know the purpose of the task? What time is available? What length of text do you use in a reading test, or length of the talk in a listening test? Is the addressee specified? Do the kids know the marking criteria? And also, what are the linguistic demands of the test in terms of lexical range, structural range, etc.? So, the second question of a test, if you're interested in construct validity, are the characteristics of the test task an adequate and comprehensive representation of those that would normally be encountered in real life? And lastly, scoring validity. How far do the criteria that you use in assessing speaking or assessing writing, how do they reflect the construct in an appropriate way? And the additional need to think about how much we can depend on the scores we give. So the construct volumes, the 4 volumes examining writing, reading, listening, speaking, listening, sorry, right order, were a first attempt to define construct validity in a way that could be operationalized by exam boards at different proficiency levels. So it became very clear to us when we were writing those volumes that we were writing for those exam boards who have exams at A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2. And if you're going to do that efficiently accurately and appropriately, you cannot afford to ignore cognitive processing. And that was difficult for me to get to terms with, because in my training as an applied linguist, we'd never really focused on cognitive psychology. We'd focused on language. And I think that what I would see happening in the 21st century is, I think, more and more exam boards will have to pay greater attention to it. Because as soon as you know something about cognitive psychology, you have to ask yourself the question, why am I using multiple choice tests? Because the cognitive processes, say in a multiple choice reading test, are not the same as the cognitive processes one would employ in real life reading for general or academic purposes. The cognitive processes in writing, if you just give students, and I'm thinking here perhaps of academic students, the cognitive processes of a simple statement which the students have to write about will lead to knowledge telling. And knowledge telling is not something that's expected of students when they go to university. They're expected to read multiple texts, transform those texts into their own version and employ intertextuality. So I think my strong feeling is that in a revised CFR, in revised exams of the future, we have to pay more attention to cognitive as well as contextual. Which leads me to the last British Council examples. When Barry O'Sullivan and I were asked to develop a new placement test for the British Council back in, I think we started about 2007, we were asked to be innovative. Well, that's just about the time that the constructs volumes were taking off, so we were able to incorporate into the reading test at least, or in particular, a notion that you can operationalize cognitive processing at different levels. We were able to incorporate the notion that you could actually analyze texts so that the different levels exhibited different indices in terms of grammatical complexity, lexical range, difficulty, and other features. So the tests, in a sense, became, interestingly, more scientific. The analysis that was done to produce the tests meant that we were able to specify more clearly what should be happening contextually and cognitively at the different levels in the ILA. Most recently, and the last example I will give you, is the example of APTIS, which is a new British Council project, which is both based entirely on the socio-cognitive framework made explicit in the constructs volumes. I think this is the first real attempt in a new exam to operationalize the socio-cognitive framework. And time will tell how successfully they have done it. But the core concepts, which I think I'll finish with, which are there at the bottom, are construct validity. You remember the quote from Alan Davis in the 1980s? The starting point is the construct. You don't start with anything else. You don't start by thinking what analysis, statistical analysis I'll do. You start with how do I operationalize the construct. The next feature or theme, core concept, which I quite like, is the theme of localization. That the tests of the future might need to take the local context into account. Are we going to be moving away from big bang general proficiency tests which can be used by all people for all purposes around the world? And I think the answer to that is no. I think we've gone through that phase, and I think we're moving back to the idea that a test for Taiwan, a test for China, or a test for Japan might have to be localized, i.e. made more appropriate to the local context, both in terms of linguistic background, culturally, domain, etc. And I think that's the way we will go in the future. There's also the interesting thing which began in Cambridge in the early 2000s, the idea of impact by design. That when you're constructing a test, you think very carefully about the effect that you want it to have. You don't wait till 5-10 years later to see what effect it's had. And lastly, and I think perhaps in many ways this will be the most important thing, is can we deliver tests at where they are relatively cheap and they have economic value. Where you have millions of candidates, say in India, who can't afford a great deal of money to take a test, is it possible to give some form of certification at those lower levels at a very low cost, maybe even at cost? And I suppose that's something which exam boards will have to think about in the future. That at the moment it's often very expensive to take tests. Are we able to deliver tests which are more accessible to a greater number of people around the world? So the second lesson, which I hope has come out of the second part of the talk, is that what's important in language testing, for me, or from a British European perspective at least, is that it's the people who are involved and the ideas that have an important influence on English language testing, especially in the UK, and that to really come to grips with language testing, I think we need to consider the ideas and the people and the situations of the people when they develop tests, as well as how we're going to analyze the tests. At that point, I'll finish. Thank you.